Welcome to The Digital Patient, where we discuss the latest advancements in digital patient engagement and share stories from the front lines. I'm your host, Alan Sardana, and with me, as always, is our CEO, Dr. Joshua Liu. Today, we're joined by our very special guest, Dr. Patrick Woodard. Dr. Patrick A. Woodard is the Chief Digital Officer at Methodist Le Bonheur Healthcare in Memphis, Tennessee. In his role, he leads digital transformation initiatives for the health system with a belief that thoughtful implementation of technology solutions can transform the way that we connect as humans. He also acts as an advisor to healthcare technology companies, specifically focused on helping ensure that clinicians and patients' needs are represented throughout the product lifecycle. Prior to moving to Methodist, Dr. Woodard was CMIO and VP of Clinical Systems at Renown Health, and he previously founded and ran DocDocs, a physician software startup. He holds a bachelor's degree from Georgetown University, an MD from the University of Nevada, and a Master of Healthcare Administration from the George Washington University. Dr. Woodard, Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's fantastic to have you on. You know, we dug into a lot of the background on you. I know you've moved to Methodist in the past year, so pretty fresh there and really offering a lot of new perspectives to the digital space in healthcare. And from what I've gathered online, it seems like technology and healthcare tech has really been an interest of yours for a long, long time. I believe you learned to code as a hobby during med school and then founded DocDocs shortly after that. Really curious to start the conversation, where did that passion come from for health tech?
It's a really good question. And to be honest with you, if you'd asked me, even when I was founding DocDocs, if that's where I was going to end up or what I would end up doing, I think I probably would have said no. My and appreciation for health tech in particular comes from what I see as a lot of similarity between health tech and health policy, which is where I originally thought I was going to go. So before I went to med school, it was kind of one of those things where I was admitted to medical school. And so you're kind of in that pipeline and the train is going, but I wasn't quite there yet. And so I had an opportunity to pursue a couple of other, senior year college, you can kind of, I don't want to say goof off, but take things that are a little bit to the side of what your major was. And it's your opportunity to kind of expand your horizons. And part of that was taking a health policy course. And the only real outcome of that was you had to pass something through Congress. And that was kind of how you got your grade, which as a senior who needed a passing score to graduate made it a little bit stressful. And we were a team of 4 college seniors, and we were able to get 7 words added into a bill that ended up passing in Congress, which enhanced the ability for 30,000 teachers to go and get additional education in STEM training, pedagogical training, which if you kind of track that forward, that is 1 million students who had better STEM education because 4 college seniors put 7 words into a bill. So for me, it was kind of oh, this is really cool. I can dramatically change the way that we're delivering STEM education for 1 million kids with a couple of kids working 12 weeks at the end of the semester trying to graduate college. And so for me, that was kind of my entry into, there's something beyond medicine, right? I can see one patient at a time, whether I'm in a hospital sitting at their bedside or in a clinic in the exam room. But if I'm able to change the policy, I can dramatically improve the way that we're caring for hundreds of thousands or millions or tens of millions of people. So that was kind of the original click. And as I was kind of growing DocDocs and expanding our client base and looking at the way that the care was being modulated by the software, which was originally designed just to solve a very niche problem at a hospital, which was still on paper, we were able to see some of those changes that I had initially seen in health policy occurring, right? People were doing better handoffs. They were communicating better about their patients. They were able to do some of the things that they weren't able to do on paper. And I realized that for me, the same driver of positive outcomes at a grander scale was possible through health tech. And at that point, I was deep into it. It's obviously something that I'm passionate about. And I was able to kind of really reconcile what I had seen in health policy now in health tech. So that's really what drives me, what gets me excited about it, and keeps me going, and really gives me a lot of hope about the way that we can use technology to improve the way that we care for people.
And Patrick, for those who aren't as familiar with DocDocs, do you mind just unpacking what was the initial problem you were solving, and what was the start of that company?
Yeah, so I had been nerdy in college and had learned to code, and it was kind of one of those things that you kind of put on the shelf and you hope you maybe don't need, right? And then when I was in residency, I'm an internist by background, and so we had some patient that came in overnight, and her symptoms were kind of vague, seemed like chest pain like, and she had a minor elevation of her troponin, which tended to point towards a cardiac cause of her symptoms. So she was admitted to the cardiac team. And then it became clear overnight that her symptoms were evolving, and it was actually a stroke, not a heart issue. It was it was a stroke, and she was transferred to a different team overnight. The night resident put them on their list, which was paper, and then the night resident went home, and the paper list went with them, and the patient wasn't seen. The outcome was not great, and maybe would have been the same, but that doesn't feel really good when you have a patient's family who thinks like, oh, my mom was forgotten about, oh, my wife was forgotten about. So it was originally just designed to solve that problem, which is to say, like, you can't exist nowhere. Like, if you're in the system, you have to exist somewhere, and somebody has to be on record for you, and you can't like disappear from a list, which is effectively what happened when that resident went home with a piece of paper, was she disappeared. Now, granted, this was a different era, and we were on paper, and there were a lot of things that still needed to be put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen, process, and those kind of things. But it really grew out of that into a tool that became useful for hospitalists in long-term acute care facilities, SNFs, which still today are really kind of lacking in terms of what they have available in terms of just EMRs, right? I mean, low margins, high cost of EMRs makes it difficult. So we found some success in that area, and it was really designed around how do we make sure that nobody gets lost in the system. So
I got to say, I mean, like, I'm sure there are a lot of clinicians in your shoes who've identified a similar problem, but it takes a pretty big amount of courage and time and investment of yours to actually go and start something. So kudos to you. So I actually haven't been on the wards for probably over 10 years clinically. So back, I mean, even 10 years ago, I remember like I was still having to print out everything in patient lists and writing lab values on sheets of paper. I'm curious, like, what's the standard of care today now if you're a clinician on the ward? Has it shifted to digital for that information, or are most places still doing printout lists? I never quite figured out where it is now.
It's a blend. I think, the modern EMRs have digital tools embedded with them to kind of do some of your rounding and your handoff and those kind of things. But that being said, the last time I rounded, I still printed a list and wrote my notes on paper. Part of it comes down to, and I think this is something that I really am passionate about, is that moment, you only have a moment when you're in a room with a patient to connect with them. And if you're looking at an iPad or a phone, even if it's to look at something that's relevant to that patient, they don't know that, right? It's kind of like if you're sitting in a restaurant and the waiter or waitress or server comes up to you and takes your order and is looking at a phone and putting it in their phone, there's something that's disconnecting, right? It's like they're looking at that instead of communicating with you. And I understand the efficiency gains, but there's something that's a little bit inhuman about why are we not having eye contact right now? So that's why I print. Also, it's easier just to like scribble something than to try and you can scribble a couple words and figure out what it means when you get outside the room and fill in the rest. It's a little bit harder to do digitally. To that end, I think I'm not a digital native. I'm close, but I'm not. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the generation of physicians and other providers coming out of school today may interact with the tool differently than I would. And I think it will be really interesting to see what we're asking our vendors to put in the software as well, which I think is another area where I think there's a lot of opportunity just broadly as a health system, not like at a health system level or at a vendor level, but like at the global level, to say like, how do we want to take feedback? Because, for example, physicians and nurse practitioners may be very insulated from some of the difficulties in the EMR, because for $15 an hour, you can have a 22-year-old follow you around and do the things you don't want to do, which means that there's not a really good feedback loop, and there's not a huge incentive for an EMR company to change something, because they don't have physicians banging on the door because they have a 22-year-old $15 an hour person scribing away. So I think being able to recognize some of those shifts in how are we presenting information to clinicians will maybe change how they're willing to either use paper or not. Many years ago, actually, when I was doing docs, I met a CMIO who had a bounty program where he would pay $100 to anybody who could figure out how to get rid of a printer. And he didn't have to do it very much because nobody wanted to really get rid of their printer. And I don't know if he's still doing that today, but I suspect they were not really getting rid of that many printers. I think there's still a lot of people who want to go home with a piece of paper, or to be able to hand somebody a piece of paper, and saying like, oh, I pushed it to my chart may not be quite what people are looking for.
Patrick, I apologize. We have this fire alarm going off. I don't know if you can hear it. I hope not.
Now I can. I didn't before.
Okay. So if we go on mute, that's why. So hopefully we can work through it. I'm sure Alan and I will survive. So I know on LinkedIn you mentioned you're a startup survivor. I'm guessing from living through docs, but you're in this unique situation where you've been on both sides of the table, right? You've been the startup founder, pitching this and getting this into hospitals and health systems, and now you're on the other side, full time, partnering potentially with startups and digital health vendors. I'm curious how your experience being on the startup founder side has shaped how you think health systems should partner with startups.
That's a really interesting question, and one that I like a lot. It definitely changes how I view what people will promise, because I also know what I promised that I knew was something that I would deliver eventually, but definitely was not possible today. I think that's probably the area maybe it colors it most. And I certainly feel for the pain of the sales cycle and the number of conversations you have that are really, really promising that are going to go somewhere next week, and next week comes never. Those types of things certainly don't make it easier to say no today. But I think the biggest thing that I actually feel like I've learned more on the health system side is how woefully unprepared most vendors are, whether they're startups or well-heeled vendors with a big portfolio, to be able to actually work within the health system environment. We get really focused on like, how do we solve this narrow problem? But we forget that the narrow problem doesn't exist in a vacuum. They're all related in some way. And so, you see a really good solution to a problem that I hope you maybe knew in advance that you had, and maybe you didn't, and maybe you do a little bit of investigation in your health system and you find out, yes, it is a problem we have, and the solution is really good, but it requires that you use, and I'm making this up, but it requires that you use their own web app to solve it rather than being integrated into the EMR. So now I have to go to clinicians and say, hey, we can solve your problem, but you have to log into this other system. And by the way, like we'll do single sign-on, but that'll take an extra 3 months because we have to get the security teams to do all of the single sign-on integration. Those are I think the things that are difficult and almost impossible to solve without a really good set of advisors helping you say, like, where does this, and they can be your investors, they can be like an advisory board, they can just be customers sometimes, but really to say, like, how do we integrate these things together so that from a broader health system perspective, we're able to look at this and make it holistically useful. And I say that really intentionally because there are so many really good solutions out to real problems, but without the ability to integrate them really easily, it makes it really hard for the buyer to be able to actually say yes and commit to it, because ultimately at the end of the day, the vendor is some sort of phantasm that exists behind a curtain somewhere, and you have a hospital CIO or a chief digital officer or a CMIO or others standing in front of the clinicians espousing the use of a new tool, which yes, probably does solve the problem, but if it doesn't do it in a way that the clinician can immediately buy into and it doesn't make their life harder, it's really the internal sales within the health system that they have to like convince people to use it and those kind of things. And implementation without adoption, as you know, really doesn't go too far. So I think maybe a slightly different iteration of that question is, how can the vendor help the internal sales person? Now, once they're in the health system, they're going to have to be selling on behalf of the new tool. How do they help that person be successful? And I think there are a bunch of ways that make it work. It can be, the right kind of support from the vendor on whether that's implementation or operational support. But I think more broadly, it's how do I integrate these into a tool that people already are using, rather than having to go out and use something different. So I think that's probably a challenge that we will face for quite some time, really, because Epic isn't opening up their ecosystem to let people work within. Cerner will integrate with you, but same kind of thing. It's not going to be native. It might be a native feeling, but really kind of needing to work into a system that is pretty integrated in a way that works. Because most people don't want to learn a bunch of different applications, right? Most people are okay being decent at Word and okay with Outlook, and maybe they can use something in Excel, and that's all they need to do. And for clinicians, same kind of thing. Like if you're building for an average EMR user who's a clinician, think they probably will never leave the EMR, except maybe to open PACS and look at some CT images or something like that. So a big gap between, I think, the power users who tend to start companies and advise them, and the actual average, or maybe even the below average tech literate user.
I think that's a great point. I think one of the funny things I've learned is, a lot of times, I'm sure you've seen it, investors will try to ask, the company, oh, what are your moats? What's your defensibility? Is it some fancy, network effect or data player or something else? And I think ultimately, if you're working with health systems, the right moat, the right defensibility is, well, what's going to minimize friction for adoption by not just the health system, as an organization, but the individual clinicians or users that have to adopt it? What's going to minimize friction to get that adoption? Because to your point, I think that's where the big barrier is. If you can solve that, often that's your moat, because most companies will fail at getting even adoption, get to the point where they have some technical defensibility with data or network effects. So I think you're absolutely right. It's how do you actually make adoption easy? And it sounds easy on paper.
Well, and to that point, interoperability sounds almost like the opposite of defensibility, right? Because you're saying like, oh, I'll work with you, is kind of the opposite of saying like, I have a moat and there's something proprietary there. On the other hand, though, once you're if you're interoperable and you're like in there, it's much harder to take something out that you've already put in than to put something in that maybe is better in some way. How many health systems, and I think the answer is almost all of them, if not all of them, have an application that doesn't quite meet their need, but they have a 3-year contract and it's 2 years into it, and so the sales cycle's off, or the clinicians, it's too hard to train the clinicians to use the new tool. So once you're in and you're operating well within the environment, it puts you in a really good position to be able to stay there. But it does come at the cost of needing to be very interoperable and play nice in the sandbox.
Yeah, I think that it's a great point, Patrick. And it kind of leads me into the next question. I heard a podcast episode you were on recently with Bill Russell, the This Week Health podcast. Yeah. And you shared in that discussion how there's kind of these two schools of thought for the future of how you view the EMR. And the first school of thought is that the EMR is truly the clinician's home, very similar to today where everything, clinician goes into the EMR and everything is done from within the EMR. The second school of thought is that the clinician only really has to interact with the EMR when they need certain information. The rest is automatically captured, maybe voice technology, different outputs and automations that are run through the EMR, but they don't really have to access it too often. What needs to happen in order to make that second scenario a reality?
I think it actually goes a lot back to interoperability and the willingness to open up avenues for data to flow bidirectionally. Part of it will be driven regulatorily, in that if we say that, I think CMS and the executive branch have done a pretty good job of encouraging it, but it doesn't necessarily go quite far enough to really create true interoperability, which is, I think, in fairness, very difficult to perform. So I like to use the example of like a PACS order, like a radiology order. So if you order a CT scan, there's the order itself. You have a whole bunch of demographic information. You have ADT information about that patient that's necessary to flow over. So we have all of that. It goes into a different system, probably a series of systems that are interfacing with a machine that also needs to have some of that information, but not all of the information. Once the study is performed, you have the actual images themselves in a DICOM format, presumably. You have the same kind of identifying information about the patient, plus then you have a read from a radiologist, which is done probably in a different system, probably in the PAC system, but definitely not in your EMR. And then all of that needs to come back over into the EMR, and there's a bunch of like admission data, whether that's done as an outpatient or an admitted patient, the claims and necessary billing information that are associated with that, plus the DICOM image, plus the read. So if I'm a third party that I'm asking for information about CT studies, which part of that do you want? Is it all of it? Probably not. But there's some parts that are more relevant than another. And so if it's for third-party billing, I may only care about which study was performed, who read it, maybe a diagnosis associated with it, and some of the identifying information so that I can bill. But if I'm a neurosurgeon and I'm trying to pull that into my own EMR in my own neurosurgery clinic, I want the images, and I may not care about really any of the other stuff except to make sure that it matches up with the same patient in my EMR. So trying to say, from a regulatory perspective, all of that has to interface in a streamlined way is incredibly complex. And that's just one type of study, right? I mean, then there's thousands of CPT codes for all the different types of procedures you can perform, minus, the imaging and just other executables, whether those labs, whatever, or even kind of thing like as simple as a nursing order for towels, something like that, right? And which is like a non-billable, it doesn't really mean anything. It's more of a communication, but it gets built out because you're tired of clinicians like free writing things into the comment field because you can't do anything with that later from a data perspective. I mentioned that all to say, like, to get to a level where we have things that are appropriately sitting on top enough that the EMR just works as a database in the background, we need to be able to parse out which pieces of those information are actually relevant for a particular user. It's role-based in a way, right? Because I know that an insurance company plays a different role in the patient's care than the neurosurgeon, which plays a different role than the care navigator, which plays a different role than the pharmacist. And it's context-based too. An outpatient procedure has a different level of timeliness most of the time than one that's done in an ED. And the context in which I want to review the same information is going to be completely different, even if I'm in the same role in two different environments, right? So in an outpatient clinic, if I'm looking for a potential brain mass, I'm going to be looking at things a little bit differently than if a patient's coming in after a trauma, same scan, same role, same neurosurgeon, different kind of context. And so I'm looking for different things, and different pieces of information are more critical. Maybe their vital signs are also matter because maybe the images don't show anything, but the patient's blood pressure is collapsing, right? So completely different context for the same data. I think we'll get there, but it's going to require, you can't do it all at once. So it's going to require places and organizations which are kind of forward thinking in terms of how do we add context and role together in a way that we're able to reasonably know based on who you are and what we're doing, what you may be interested in seeing. So I think it'll be a really exciting period of time, but it won't feel like anything's happening, I think, for a long time, just simply because of the level of complexity there. To say, like, maybe it does start in something that's relatively low risk. I don't think the ED trauma environment would be the place that you want to start with that, because if it's failing, like you don't have time to call the help desk. So I think maybe like lower risk places are a great place to start, and then really building that into the kind of world where the EMR is a good kind of data repository, or one of a couple data repositories that allow for that kind of like contextual and role-based access to clinically relevant information in a way that can be kind of customized to the end user. So as an example, and this is not new, this is not my concept, but the idea of your iPhone itself is probably looks like nobody else's iPhone except for the hardware, right? Like if you launch your start screen, it has different information on it and you choose and move it around. And I mean, maybe like some of our parents might have very similar iPhones because they never customized it, but for the most part, people customize their stuff or at least put a picture of their kids or their dog or whatever. There's no reason that we wouldn't want to be able to do that and have, especially when we're able to get to a place where the machine kind of knows based on what your role is, what you're more likely to be interested in, and adding the context to it to say, like, if you're in the ED, you definitely care a lot about vital signs and some initial labs that are popping up. Then if you're in an outpatient clinic, you probably have a lot more time to think about those things. And maybe you're more interested in a trend line rather than what's happening to you right in front of you.
I mean, you can imagine a moment in the future where, let's say, based on what your schedule is, if the software knows that you're doing, I don't know, an overnight call shift or something, the things that you care about at that moment in time are very different than when you're in clinic in the day, or if you're, you know, I don't know, a provider in the OR, it's something very different. So that's actually a pretty cool future to think about. Actually, maybe it's a good segue. I know Alan found this article that you shared on explainable AI. Maybe that's a good segue, Alan.
Yeah, for sure. So there was an article, Patrick, you shared about explainable AI, which is basically, well, it's kind of like understanding what the outputs are, what the variables are that you're putting into this black box that is AI. Basically a way to explain what the AI is doing and explain the result that's coming from the machine. So you had a point when you shared that article that explainable AI is useful, but it could slow progress, and it really could stall innovation in terms of having to explain every single part about how the AI is working, how that black box is working. And so I was wondering if you could share, your thoughts around how you're leveraging AI or how you plan to leverage AI, and where you determine that balance between having a perfect explanation for what the AI is doing and then also balancing nimble innovation on the other hand.
Yeah, I think it's really an interesting kind of thought exercise, maybe is the way to think about it, in that as more tools either come with AI like out of the box or something that you're purchasing on purpose, the understanding of what occurs in there, I think, is going to be increasingly more relevant. I don't know, maybe it was about a year ago or so, it was in the last 12 to 18 months, an article about Epic's AI model for sepsis. And the authors found that it wasn't maybe as accurate as Epic had thought. And not to delve too deeply into the pros and cons of the article and whether or not the authors were themselves accurate, it brings up one of the most widely used AI models that was kind of like one of those that kind of came out of the box, but that maybe hadn't been quite trained on the particulars of that hospital, or maybe the data mapping wasn't done correctly, or maybe didn't take into account some additional elements and was causing real patient outcomes. I think in that particular model, Epic does a good job of saying, like, these are the elements that are more relevant for decision making, and this is why a particular score is a different way. But a lot of elements maybe don't say that, right? So the article that I think you're referencing used a training set for COVID patients who had chest x-rays that did or did not have COVID. And the training set that they used was a publicly available training set that all had the R symbol on the upper right-hand side of the image, which is pretty common. And that's how you use to know that it's the right side versus the left side of the radiograph. And because the model had been trained on a single data set that all of those were very similar, the model was actually looking to say, like, oh, that R must be part of the, instead of meaning right, it must mean that this patient doesn't have COVID because it came from a COVID negative training set that all had the R there. Now, obviously, like, you and I all know, like, well, that's stupid to exclude that. And a radiologist would know immediately not to do that. But without understanding that that's what the machine itself is looking at, you could have a very accurate model based on the training set that you use that does, in fact, show that none of those people have COVID, as long as they have have their right chest marking on there, right? Which of course is absurd in real life, but a very real thing. And I think, there's an interesting, this is very old actually, but it's a really interesting concept in that this is, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, there was a very interesting study where they, in the chest x-rays, put a photo of a gorilla kind of in the image, just like in the lung. And it was missed by something like 2/3 of the radiologists. And it's not because the radiologists are bad, but because that's not a pathology that they're typically looking for. You follow the same pattern reading any chest x-ray that you have followed for years. And that's like how you learn to read the chest x-rays. Mine was ABCDE. The E stands for everything else. Now, in some models, everything else should include gorilla, but that's not normally what you're looking for. And a computer, of course, missed it or caught that there was a gorilla every time. So I think there's a different version in which you can train something on a standard x-ray and then put something abnormal in there, and the machine's going to say this is abnormal. But we also have to understand what standard looks like. And I think especially now, the R example for COVID patients is interesting, but maybe not so clinically relevant because you can fix that immediately. What would maybe be also interesting and definitely clinically relevant is, what if your training set is only white men? I don't know physiologically that a white male and a black male have very different chest x-rays, but a machine might find some differences on there that have to do with skin tone or like the lucency of the image. And that without explaining that or understanding that that has something to do with it, something, then you're going to have potentially negative outcomes that are not because of intentional bias, but because of bias that isn't necessarily visible without the machine explaining it. So understanding that will be critical. And to the point that it will, if you don't have to explain how everything works and you're getting good outcomes 100% of the time, then that works. But when you're getting good outcomes 99% of the time, there's 330 million people in this country. I mean, do you want to be one of the 3.3 million people who have a negative outcome because the machine didn't explain it? That's a lot. Yeah. So I think even small fractions of a percent, which can potentially change how we're delivering care, can have a huge impact negatively or positively, but potentially negatively on the outcome. And so I think for that reason, it's really important for us to step back and say, like, we can move very quickly, but at a risk. So we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we deploy.
And I'm curious, because I haven't like really gone into this deeply myself, but like when you are using any solutions lately that are based on pre-existing models, is it typically that like you're implementing the solution in your environment, and then at the same time it's being continuously trained on more data from your system as it comes in while you use it? Or is it that you're just using it out of the box as is because it's pretty good and it's not really learning more from your data?
Yeah, some of them come out of the box as is and they don't really learn more from your data, which I think is a shame, because more data in a machine learning model is better, especially because things will change over time and your environment may be different and your patient population is certainly different from wherever they trained it. That being said, many models do rely on kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily retraining it on your data, but kind of tweaking to your data, kind of making sure that your area under the curve is reasonably close to what the actual model is based on after you've trained it on your own patient population. An individual health system's total patient population is a drop in the bucket compared to what a machine may need to actually learn and have something that's repeatable. I mean, if you have a prevalence that's let's say you have a prevalence of 5%. In our system, we have like 1.5 million records. That's only 750 or 75,000 people. So that's not that many records to train on. And that's a relatively high prevalence. 5% is pretty high. That's like diabetes, but that's still only 75,000 records that you could train on. So those types of things are important to keep in mind, that an individual health systems data set is not that big. So it's important to include that, but as part of a broader data set.
Is that something that at this point is a factor when like organizations are thinking about like their EHRs that they may consider switching to? Are you hearing that, hey, actually I'm considering switching to X EHR because we're going to have access to some consolidated data set across the network of health systems on it, and that's going to allow us to deliver better care? Or are we not yet at the point where that data is being used and shared broadly across systems on an EHR, and so it's not really a conversation point?
I wouldn't say it's a primary driver. I think there certainly are conversations when you're able to look across, and at least, so I'd say maybe a better driver of that's related is the ability to benchmark across similar health systems. I think that's probably more interesting. Both Epic and Cerner, which are kind of the main players in the bigger health system market these days, are doing some good stuff with de-identified data for research data sets. I mean, Epic has their research data set available. Cerner has another one that just is also available that's de-identified and good for looking at broader populations. I want to say that the Flint water crisis was found in Epic's broader data set, but it might have just been in their own health systems using their internal tools. But I think those are certainly beneficial, but I wouldn't say from a purchasing perspective, they necessarily are driving the decision. I think there's a lot of other elements that maybe are more salient on a day-to-day basis. I think it certainly is a nice adjuvant benefit after the fact, right? So, but I wouldn't say, I don't think there's a whole lot of CFOs who are signing up for big checks because they have access to a slightly larger data pool. I don't know that that's a huge driver.
That's a good point. I think, Alan, I also want to touch, I think one of your unique aspects to your story has been how it seems like music has played a really important role. And actually my wife is really into violin herself. So actually learning that about you caught my yeah. Fun fact, so you grew up playing the violin. I think Alan found that you studied at Hopkins for violin performance or something in that realm.
Yeah, I went to the Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore, which is part of Johns Hopkins.
Amazing. So we were wondering, how does your musical training, and particularly being part of an orchestra, which you still are from what we've read, how does that shape, I guess, your views on technology and interoperability in healthcare?
What an interesting question. You know, as a violinist, you're kind of one of many, right? In the section is typically, unless you're playing like a string quartet or something, the section is typically like 12 to 20 violinists, and there's 2 sections of first and second. So there's make that 30, like anywhere between like 24 and 40 violinists, depending on what you're playing. And there's a level of individual commitment that you have to make. But there's also kind of that collectivism that has to come with it as well. And the individual component is like, you have to commit to play well enough that you're not noticeable, right? Like, you don't have to be the best there, because somebody will be, and then somebody will be not the best. And so you don't have to be the best to be there, but you have to also not be the worst. And you have to at least commit to a minimum level of like, I'm going to play at least this well. I'm not going to play in any rest. I'm going to play in tune as much as I can. And I'm going to practice my runs and the hard parts of the thing so that I'm not like making a fool of myself. And then there's a commitment. There's the collective commitment, which is we all agree that we're going to start up bow, or that we're going to slur this section. And you can use whatever fingerings to play that note that you want, but your bow has to be going the same direction and at the same speed as everybody else, because there's a look that's important, there's a sound that's important, and if you deviate from that, that detracts from the music. So I think to take that and bring that over into how we deliver health tech and just healthcare more broadly using technology, there's I would say it's the same 2 requirements, right? There's an individual level that you need to bring to the game, which is I'm going to commit to doing this much interoperability and to perform at this level, and my uptime is going to be 5 nines or 4 nines or whatever. But then there's the collective component, which is I'm also going to play nice in the sandbox, and I'm not going to hoard data for myself, and I'm going to bring expertise to the table, and I'm going to help everybody else perform better, because it works better when we all are sitting in the same order and we're playing the bow in the same direction, right? So I'd say that's really how I would kind of take that as a good metaphor, is that you have to have both parts, and each part by itself is fine, but you can't play in an orchestra that way.
I love that answer. I was really curious to see, what would you share about your experience with violin playing in an orchestra, and then relating it to health tech, because I think it does, any musical training really does kind of add these tangential skills that are applied everywhere that you're going, and whether it's health tech and thinking about interoperability or just playing in an orchestra. And I think that's so neat. Kind of in line with that, you actually shared another video recently with your audience. This is from a group called Two Set Violin on YouTube, basically a duo who play in an orchestra as well. In the video, they explained that often in an orchestra, you're practicing for a performance, and then you go and do it again. You don't really take a lot of time to rest and reflect and come together kind of collectively and understand, how are we playing, how are we actually making music together. And it's sort of like being on a hamster wheel. And so you pointed out the similarity between how that activity is and how a healthcare system works as well. We're often, so hyper focused on moving from one project to the next that we fail to take the time to reflect and actually improve as a healthcare system. So I was curious just to unpack that a little bit. What did you mean by that? And what could health systems learn from this approach?
Yeah, man, we went really far down the music nerd hole today. So the concept behind it is that, and this is what they were saying, is that so for me, I will go and I'll play a concert on Saturday and Sunday. And that is rehearsals. Usually it's like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday night, rehearsal Saturday morning, and then concert Saturday, Sunday. And then there's usually one the next week, or maybe it's a couple of weeks off, and then you can do it again. And so you're improving increment. Like that first Tuesday night is usually a read through, where you just like read the performance, right? You read the symphony, or maybe you read the concerto or whatever, and you kind of take note of what things aren't good. And then you use Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to kind of dig into some of the areas that need some improvement. There's some like individual practice that happens in between rehearsals to improve like things that you personally can get better at. And then Saturday morning is a dress rehearsal, and there's very little tweaking that happens after that, right? And then it's performance time. So by Saturday morning, if it's not good, then that's gonna be what it is. The point that they were bringing up is that if you're doing that the whole time without taking a moment to reflect on how are we performing as an ensemble better, then every Tuesday you might have the same outcome. You might have the same things that are wrong because maybe it's ensemble that's your primary problem. It's not intonation or phrasing. It might be your ability to play well together, which is really important for an orchestra. It makes the difference between an amateur sounding orchestra and a professional sounding orchestra that can align together and play together really in an ensemble format. And without the ability to step back and say, what are we really doing that might be something that we need to work on more globally than just in Beethoven Symphony Number 8? What can we do to improve so that over time the orchestra sounds better just globally, and that maybe you can focus on different things during your Wednesday, Thursday, Friday night rehearsals? I would say orchestras don't do that very well. Generally, it's kind of like perform that week and then next project, which is the next concert. I'd say that health systems are better, but also probably don't really step back and to say like, how is our ensemble, right? And part of it is that projects can feel so different, right? Some project, like if you're doing a, nurse scheduling project, and then you move on and you do human capital management, and then you move on and you do ER or an EMR module, they might feel very different, and they might have a different set of players, but there's going to be a core set of players that does still need to be able to play and perform as a team. And I'd say I've been in organizations that do postmortems really well, and I've been in organizations that are just moving really fast and don't necessarily take time to do them, and you can be successful in both, but I think you could probably be more successful if you're really working on, I'm just going to call it ensemble, working on ensemble as a team. Like after this project, what really went well? And it doesn't need to be critical by any means. It can be, what things do we want to be able to do better next time, even if this went really perfectly and we had 3 help desk calls after an implementation, which would be, ideal, but unrealistic. So how are we able to like improve on that performance for the next time? And I guarantee there will be core issues, because there's always something you can improve on. So I really like the idea of being able to step back and say, like, if we're doing the same thing over again, even if it is completely different and a subset of players may change, how does that core team still improve their ensemble?
It kind of reminds me, I mean, to your point, like postmortems, I think are definitely underdone. I mean, we definitely underdo them here, but there's also the flip side of, even if something was successful or partially successful, like what are the things that we did well? And then let's just make sure to make that part of the playbook. I think often both parts of that we often miss, because we're so focused. You're pointing, all right, we finished this project, I could get to the next one. But there's probably a lot.
Thank goodness it's over. It went well, or it didn't go well. I don't know, it requires that kind of growth mindset to step back and say, like, I want to learn from this. And if it went really well, maybe you don't want to focus on the good things at all. You only want to focus on the bad. And maybe if it went really badly, yeah, you should probably focus on the bad things. But you should also say, like, what went well and what should we keep doing? I like to add to my annual evaluations with my staff, and also for me, is like, what should this person keep doing and what should this person stop doing? But I don't know why we don't do that for projects or questions. What should we keep doing and what should we stop doing? I don't know. I think there'd probably be benefit to that.
Heard it here first.
Yeah.
Yeah. Send your 2-cent commission check over here.
Yeah, you got it.
Exactly. So, Patrick, I did want to ask one last question before we jump to what we call the Fast Five. Just quickly, today there is an explosion of all these different patient-facing innovations, whether it's chatbots or digital care journeys or remote patient monitoring. I'm just curious, what are you most excited about today?
To me, I would say it's actually none of those things. And it's the collective of all of those things, because each individual element is going to be fraught with difficulty and terror along the way. Like RPA is really cool, but Olive has had a lot of bad press. And is it because Olive screwed up, or is it because the tech is just new and people aren't really experts at using it yet? Making remote patient monitoring and other RP is also very interesting, and people are doing hospital at home all over the country, but nobody's primarily admitting people to home yet, because that's terrifying. And I don't think we've reached a level of expertise yet. It's kind of like I wouldn't have gotten on the Wright brothers plane either, but I'm really glad it happened. Right. In the sense that, and I think these are more advanced than the Wright brothers planes. So I hope nobody takes offense to that. But there's a level of expertise that we will get to collectively, but it has to be one of those that we're all willing to toil through the pain of getting there. And one thing that health systems and providers at large just don't do well is fail. And there's a lot of really good reasons for it, not the least of which is that there's a person on the end of that, and failing an individual with their health isn't really acceptable. So an opportunity to fail that has like a fail safe in there that doesn't prevent the care from going downhill is important. And I understand that. So I think there's a difficulty there, but the kind of ability to step back and say, how do we integrate all of these tools together in a way, and how are we able to learn in this particular area and grow from that, so that we're learning from other people's mistakes and then building them into our own environment. Every health system is a little bit unique, but there's a lot of similarities to really all of them. Ultimately, if I'm keeping somebody well, then everything has to be right, whether you're in New York City or Cedar Rapids, Iowa, right? From that perspective, there's a lot of opportunity to kind of not reinvent the wheel, and bringing all those lessons learned together, and recognizing that good patient care looks pretty similar and bad patient care can look much different depending on how you do it. So how do we bring all the parts together in a way that is integrative and learning from the lessons that others have learned before us?
Yep. I love that. That makes a lot of sense. Patrick, just being mindful of your time, let's shift really quickly over to the Fast 5 lightning round. It's basically 5 questions to get to know you better for our audience. First question we have is, what is your favorite book or book you've gifted the most?
It's The Lean Startup, and I have given it to so many people, and whether they're in a health system or not, it's by Eric Ries, and I would consider it required reading for everybody, really, truly. There's a very brief section on intrapreneurship, which is entrepreneurship within a broader system, that I think is relevant. He did a longer book on it later, but I think the concept of, I mean, he really kind of pioneered the idea behind minimal viable products, and the kind of ability to move fast and use agile and those kind of things that I think are really critical just to being a good technologist, but also just in terms of running a good business. So I think it's absolutely critical reading, must read for everybody, whether you're an entrepreneur, an entrepreneur, or just a wannabe.
I love it. Second question, this is uniquely for you, but in what ways did being a violinist make you a better clinician?
It's the ability to connect in a way that maybe is nonverbal. You know, when you're on stage, I don't know, I was on stage when I was like 5 or 6 years old, and there's an element of performance in everything that we do, and recognizing that there's a lot of nonverbal actions that can make a 6-year-old on stage look like an amateur versus a prodigy walking up there looking like a professional. And it has to do with how you carry yourself and how you communicate nonverbally to an audience. And as a clinician, your nonverbal communication is probably more important than what you say, because if you say really calming words but you seem nervous, they're going to come out of there feeling nervous. So I don't know, what do they say? They remember how they made you feel, not what you say. Right. And so being able to bring that kind of understanding of like, I need to be present and I need to feel confident and be, open to being emotional with people that you may not know at all, is important. And that's, I think a lot of those things are important in music too, right? You need to look like you're professional, and you need to emote with people that you don't know at all, and bring that kind of, I don't know, holistic self to the game.
Yeah, I love that. Question 3, would you rather have super strength, super speed, or the ability to read people's minds?
I'd rather mind read, because then you don't need the other two.
Yeah.
That's good. But Patrick, what if you could have never turned it off? So you're hearing everyone's thoughts forever, all the time.
I'd still say yes, but I might stay home by myself a lot.
Good point. Question 4, what is something in healthcare you believe that others might find insane?
Oh, is it like things that we do that other industries might find insane?
Yeah, we can take it that way.
Okay. Yeah. How about paying more people to solve the problem instead of just solving the problem? We do this a lot. We will hire additional people to solve a problem than just instead of like fixing the thing. Yep. Scribes are a great example. Sorry. Sorry, scribes.
That's great. No, I agree. Question 5, this is a pandemic lockdown related question. What is one hobby or activity you've gotten into since the beginning of the pandemic?
I would like to say that I started this before the pandemic, but in reality, it was like February of 2020. So I don't know if it really counts. But I cook a lot. And I like to try and really like level up the skills. Like before COVID, I like to travel for food. Like I would intentionally go someplace specific to go to a particular restaurant or whatever. And I'm by no means a chef, but I like to bring some of those kind of techniques and, kind of I don't know, elements into the home. So we did a really good anchovy butter halibut, like giant halibut steak. It was just phenomenal. Those kind of fun things that are just not your normal like burger on the grill.
Right.
Nice.
Oh, that's
Now,
awesome.
don't get me wrong, I do like a good burger on the grill.
Yeah. But there's definitely certain techniques that can make it better. That's amazing. Well, awesome. Just being mindful of your time, Patrick, I want to thank you for being on the show today. You definitely provided a lot of insights for our audience. I learned a ton. I had just a blast talking with you. A lot of insights from music coming into healthcare and how you can emote non-verbally. I thought that was super interesting. So thank you for taking the time to be on the show. Just for our audience, you can find Patrick on Twitter at @pwoodard, PWOODARD. And that is a wrap for this episode of The Digital Patient, hosted by Seamless MD. You can follow us on Twitter at Seamless MD. And if you like the podcast and want to learn more, you can visit www.seamless.md. Thank you so much, Patrick.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Patrick.